Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad to see you here, and thanks to SteelOrbis that I'm able to make a report. So my presentation devoted to the Russian steel industry, and it consists of 4 parts. The first is Russian steel market outlook, the second is flat steel exports, third is impact of protectionism, and the last is changing destinations for MMK exports. So let's start from Russian steel market outlook. This is the main macroeconomic figures of Russian economy. 4 years ago, the Russian economy has problems due to geopolitical tensions and sanctions. So these events stopped the Russian economic growth. But today we can see that Russian GDP in a green zone, that the fixed capital investments are growing up, that consumer price index going down, and when we trying to forecast what will be with Russian steel consumptions, we always study different forecasts from banks, from independent consultancy companies, and from Russian authorities. So this is the basic 5-year forecast of Russian macroeconomic figures from the Russian Ministry of Economic Development. In these charts you can see that the Russian Ministry forecasts that Russian GDP growth will accelerate to 3.1% every year in nearest 5 years. So the outlook of fixed capital investments are quite well too, and that the real household income will grow up every year, and this growth will be on the level of 2.2% every year. And this is a very important figure because the private consumption is the driver for construction and for automotive industries. So you can see that consumer price index will be in the relatively low level, about 4% per year. So if we're speaking about Russian steel consumption, we should know that there are 3 major steel consuming industries. First of all is construction, the second is pipe making industry, and the third is machinery. And in machinery the most important is car making industry. So these charts show the potential of Russian steel consumption growth. You can see that residential housing by countries in Russia in the same level as in the East Europe, but far back from the West Europe. The same situation in car industry. The number of all types of vehicles per 1,000 people is much less than in the developed countries. So the key point is that if Russian citizens' real incomes will start to grow, the Russian people will resume buying new cars and resume buying apartments, flats and houses, and the residential housing will start to grow. So if we are speaking about pipelines network, you can see that its growth stopped. So the Russia has all infrastructure for exporting oil and gas. And now the Russian oil and gas companies mainly focused on developing deposits, and they stopped building new any major network pipelines. But the pipeline network is huge, and certainly we need a big number of pipes to maintain this network in condition. In the previous slide I spoke about the private consumption, but another side of steel consumption is the government spending. In this slide you can see that the Russia behind the leading countries by the different infrastructure. For example, in the length of railroads, in the length of automotive roads. Russia has a little number of airports compared with USA, for example. So there is a lot of space for investing, for government investing for this infrastructure. And you know that the oil prices is quite well. So Russia has a sovereign fund of national wealth, and Russian government allocated a big amount of money in this fund, and there is a rule that if this fund, the share of this fund is more than 7% of GDP, Russia can spend this money on different projects. Certainly, there are different ways to spend money. Money could be spent abroad to prevent inflation growth. Money could spend on the infrastructure, or money can be kept for the future. So the last year, Russian government designed 11 national projects. These projects aim of this project is to make the Russian life more better than it now. So the 3 of these 11 projects are related to the infrastructure. Backbone infrastructure development, the road network development, housing, and the urban development. So the investments assessed at the level of $400 billion, its overall investments. And these 3 national projects accumulate about half of overall investments, about $200 billion. And if this money will be spent correctly and in an efficient, my estimations is that it will drive steel consumption in Russia to 3 million tons of steel per year, every year, additional to the market. So this is the overall picture of the Russian steel demand. You should know that this is in MMK assortment, and the overall steel consumption in Russia is about 5 or 6 million tons higher than the figures on this slide. So you can see that the local minimum of home steel consumption was in 2016, and after this year, steel consumption started to recover. And we expect, given that the household real income will grow and the Russian authorities could spend a big amount of money to infrastructure, we expect that steel consumption in Russia will continue to grow. And if we're speaking about the structure, you can see on this slide that construction and regional distribution is the biggest consumer of steel, then pipes and tubes, and then automotive, machinery industry. And if we speak about the structure by types of steel products, the main product is longs, then it's flat hot rolled steel, heavy plate, flat cold rolled steel, and after that coated steel. So let's move to the flat steel exports from Russia. Everyone knows that Russia is a big exporter of steel, and Russia is constantly among the top 5 largest exporters of steel. And Russia can export steel when the prices are high and if the prices are low. So the export flows are sustainable. It's because Russia has big advantage in the costs, because Russia has its own main raw material resource. And for example, on this chart you can see that HRC production costs in Russia very good compared to its main competitors. And the trade volumes in the world steel flat markets are very good. It's about 200 million tons per year flat steel trade. Certainly Russia can find opportunities to export its flat steel all over the world. So this is the structure of Russian exports. These figures contain only flat steel exports. There is no semi-finished steel here. So you can see that the main export product is hot rolled steel, hot rolled coils and hot rolled sheets. And the maximum of steel export was in 2016 because home consumption was weak and Russian steel companies trying to export more steel than it was. So you can see that in the last 2 years the exports of hot rolled steel is going down because the home consumption is good and because Russian steel companies investing in the capacities of to produce coated steel. So more steel is re-rolled to the coated steel and less amount of this hot rolled steel is going abroad. If we study geography of exports, we can find that MENA is the main export destination for Russian steel. Certainly it is going down because the Iran under sanctions and because in Turkey consumption declined very much. And we can see that exports to the Far East is started to grow. So, impact of the protectionism on steel markets. We can evaluate this impact in two sides of volume and value. If we're speaking about volume, we can see that the imports to MENA declined a lot, but it declined because of Turkey or because Iran. It's declined not related to sanction. If we speak about West Europe, they import almost the same. North America import started to grow, and the CIS is the same. If we speaking about the prices, you can see that blue line, it's the hot rolled prices in USA, and these prices started to grow when the anti-dumping investigation started. But now the prices in United States are not much higher than in the world. And the red line, it's the HRC price in Europe, is roughly speaking in the same level as it was. So the key is that duties certainly changed some export flows, and certainly American steel companies benefited from this, but overall prices in the world are the same as it were. So let's examine the USA steel market and European steel market. You can see that steel production in USA grew in good extent, and the import is much lower than it was. If we speak about the main exporting regions to the USA, we can see that Far East went down, and the Canada and Mexico, the winners of this situation. If we examine European Union, we can find that steel production is going down in current year, that the imports from third countries is growing because some of the suppliers are gone, for example, China or Russian steel, and the Turkey increased its exports in a very large extent to the European Union. So changing destination markets for MMK. There are a lot of investigations against Russian steel companies all over the world. Every year, it's about more than 100 new anti-dumping investigations against Russian steel. Certainly, the export business became much more complex than it was, and in almost in every region and every big country, there are some investigations and duties. But what's the MMK position in so complex environment? MMK's strategic advantage is that MMK focusing on the domestic demand, and MMK made huge investments in their own capacities to produce steel, which are consumed at home, not going abroad. You can see the structure of MMK sales. 75% of sales are going to the Russian customers, 14% to the CIS countries, and only 11% go abroad. The Magnitogorsk Iron and Steel Works are trying to gain all advantages from its position at home region. MMK situated in Urals and Volga federal districts. This district consumes about 1/3 of steel in Russia, and the share of MMK shipments in this region is 63%. So MMK's strategy is to build long-term partnerships with home consumers and try to sell steel at home. But certainly the export is important option in terms of risk management. You know that the situation on the world is changing rapidly, and certainly there could be any geopolitical problems or something like this, and certainly if the Russian economy won't grow as in the Russian ministry forecast, certainly MMK will able to start to export steel in much more extent than it's doing now. So this is MMK export structure. You can see that the Middle East is the main foreign consumer of MMK steel. The Middle East is situated not far away from Russian export ports, and MMK knows this market, so that's why it's the biggest consumer of steel. Suddenly, in the last year, the export amount started to decline, but it's all about Turkey and Iran, because consumption is going down. And you can see that the export to Far East started to grow, and export to Africa started to grow also. If we examine structure of MMK export sales by types of steel, mainly it's flat hot rolled steel. Because this type of steel is has good demand on the international market, and certainly MMK satisfied this demand. So conclusions are: the potential demand for steel in the Russian Federation is observed in the building and construction industry, car making and pipe making industries, plus demand from public investment in national projects. The expected average annual growth rate of apparent steel consumption in the next 5 years comes to 1.7%. Russia is consistently ranked among the top 5 exporters of steel products due to the flexibility of steel sales and high cost efficiency. Protectionist policies increase uncertainty in the global market and redistribute export flows. MMK's strategic advantage in the context of protectionism on the global market are in the long-term partnerships with Russian steel consumers. Nevertheless, due to its high cost competitiveness and flexible sales policy, MMK also feels confident on the export markets. Thank you very much for your attention.